Hello and welcome to another edition of Beyond the Headlines. I'm Ryan Gilchrist, Managing Editor of Post and Courier Greenville. We appreciate you being with us today. We're going to be talking about a story that we published late last week on rural land in Greenville County. And really, that topic extends far beyond that subject. We'll get into that in just a moment. Joining me today is Conor Hughes, who's a reporter with Post and Courier Greenville. Welcome, Conor.
Thanks. I appreciate it. Happy to be here.
Now, Conor covers a lot of local government, but as we all know, that sort of extends into a whole lot of other topics, including what we'll talk about today, a lot with housing, real estate, development, zoning. So we'll touch on a wide range of issues. Quickly, before we get into it, I always try to be sure and mention, and I'll bring it up again later, do consider a subscription to the Post and Courier. Your subscription definitely makes things like this possible, allows me and Conor to sit here and talk about these subjects a little deeper. If you're not quite sure whether you want to subscribe yet, do check out our newsletters, and I'll have more information on those later. So a quick plug, but let's get back into the topic. So Greenville, and really the Upstate and the entirety of South Carolina in a lot of ways, is experiencing growth, in particular residential growth, like it's really never seen before. At the same time, large rural land ownership, and we're seeing this in Greenville County, is reaching sort of a fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth generation, and both a dilution in the stake of ownership, and in some ways a disconnection from what the land was used for before. Those two forces have sort of combined to bring some rural landowners to crossroads. It's not necessarily that they're being forced out. It's more like they're reaching a point where there's simply a forced choice to be made. And that's largely what Conor's written about. Conor, we're going to assume most of the people who are watching this have read your story. So let's see if we can tap into some of the things that aren't in the story. What initially piqued your interest? What started your reporting on this subject?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I've been covering local governments in this area for a little while now. I started really honing in on the Golden Strip area. It's just about a year ago now that I started covering that area. So I'm sure everyone kind of knows, but just to clarify, so that's Malden, Simpsonville, Fountain Inn, really that strip and around it is an area called the Golden Strip, and covering local government there. And something that became clear right off the bat, which wasn't a surprise to me, but I mean, the big topic of discussion was this development that's going on. There's just a real transformation in the area. There's just a tremendous amount of people moving to that area, and there have to be houses built there to support that. So that's what's been going on. And those are some of the most contentious planning commission meetings, the most contentious city council meetings. You notice that when you go to planning commission, the commissioners, that are there talk about how this is they're seeing some of the most well-attended meetings that they've seen in their tenure on those bodies, just because there are so many people that are concerned about what's going on, want to know more about what's going on. There are some, there are people who support what's going on. There's just a tremendous amount of conversation about it, and something, no matter what the meeting was I went to, whether it was an official city council or planning commission meeting, whether it was, something totally unrelated to that, that's what people were talking about. So it became very clear that was, an important coverage area, and we've done a lot of coverage just on these specific developments and what's going on. But, really wanted to do something a little bit deeper and broader on it to give people a sense of what's really happening. And what kind of ended up presenting itself was that, in order for these places to be built, the people who own the land have to be willing to sell it. And so the families and the people who own this land that are kind of at the center of this really became the focus of this kind of deeper coverage. And how that really started was a family that actually didn't make it into the story for reasons that I'll explain in just a minute here. Just popped up on my radar. It was a family that had owned a large parcel of land in this area for quite a while. It's a parcel that they had farmed for generations. Talking to the guy who's really kind of at the center of this for the family. His grandfather was born in the farmhouse. They'd owned it for a long time before that. And it's just come to a point where there's been so many generations that own this land that there's 15 or 16 cousins who now own it together. And they live all over the place. A few of them live in this area, but a lot of them live in Columbia or Charleston. A lot of them live out of state, and just, even with the size of the land, that ownership, as you mentioned, it's been so diluted. And it's just become kind of a logistical nightmare to own it. And as that's happening, there's this, the economics of this are shifting pretty quickly, where it's becoming, it's hard to justify for them at this point not selling. And if they hold on to it for another generation, that's going to be their kids or their grandkids, where it's going to be, 40, 50 people who own it. And at that point, it's going to be so diluted that, they don't want to get to that situation. So they're coming to a point where they're thinking of selling. And the reason why they weren't in the story was because it was so hard to get everybody on board, these 15, 16 cousins that live all over the country, to see if they were comfortable being in this story. So that the fact that it's so difficult to manage that, the idea of managing this land and managing the sale and kind of the logistics of it, kind of speaks to that generational, the generational complications that can arise with this. So that's what really kind of piqued my interest, is what does this mean for people whose roots are so deep in this area that are coming to this crossroads now, and what kind of, factors, kind of contribute to that decision-making process.
Sure. And as you're talking about the number of people who are involved in this, and we'll get back to some of the family dynamics and some of the folks you talk to, because I know, well, first of all, I should just ask, how long have you been reporting on this?
Sure. So I think that it was maybe October that I first started. So it's been, about half a year now. So it's been a few months. And a lot of that's just, it's a very emotional topic for people. So just making sure people are comfortable with talking to me and sharing everything. And also just kind of, with these kind of, property ownership, it is complicated, and kind of working that through and making sure it's properly researched and everything. There was a lot of moving parts with it. So it's been about 6 months now.
So you and I talked fairly early on. I think you'd done a bit of reporting, and we were starting to see that we had a choice to make, I think, which was either make the story so enormous that it encompassed either all of South Carolina or the entire United States, or focus down sort of more tightly to a specific area. So, we went in the direction of how do we focus down in one spot and sort of use that as an avatar, representation of other areas. So tell me specifically, what was the area you sort of focused down on, sort of define it geographically for us, and why did you sort of set that as the scope?
Sure. So it was kind of a very specific kind of strip of southern Greenville County. So it was, these three towns, Malden, Simpsonville, Fountain Inn, and kind of the surrounding areas. We went a little bit, out of, that direct area, but, that was essentially really where we were zeroing in on. And I think, a lot of that was just through our conversations, if we did try and do the whole state, it would just become so unwieldy. And folks, I think what's happening in this area is really kind of emblematic of what's going on in a lot of places. That area does have a very specific identity, and it's one that, I had kind of immersed myself in and had been learning a lot about. So it just seemed like that would be really the best place to focus. And, there, obviously, this is Southern Greenville County that we were looking at, but this is something that, not just all of South Carolina, but all of Greenville County, especially kind of the northern areas. It's something that's going on, really all over the place. But we felt that if we really zoned in on this and kind of zeroed in on it, and made this our focus, it would be kind of representative of what's going on across the state. And I think that's been reflected in a lot of the responses that we've gotten, where people are saying, oh, this is going on in my backyard as well. People in the low country, people in the Midlands, people, throughout the Upstate. And we've, I've heard a lot from people who are talking about what happened to them in Illinois or Virginia. It's a very, it's a story that they really relate to, even though geographically it's totally separate from where they experienced it.
Right. Yeah. And I think that definitely comes through in the story. It's about some specific folks in a specific area, but definitely feels like a shared experience elsewhere. Let's talk a little more about the people. As you said, you've got several in the story. There were others that you spoke to who didn't make it into the story, which for those of you out there that aren't familiar with reporting, the stories often have very difficult cuts in them. So, we wanted to try to sort of not repeat ourselves too much in the story, but talk a little bit more about the people. Talk about the folks you sat down with. In some cases, the reluctance to talk about the subject and why it is just such a difficult topic for some folks.
Sure. So really the people who were in the story, it really came down to three families specifically. So the one who I kind of led the story with, and to also kind of was at the end of the story there's a guy named George Hughes and his family who owns a property right in the Fountain Inn area that has been in the family for, since before the Revolutionary War, before America was a country, is how I think I put it in the story. And he has a cattle farm, but his main source of income is, he's a dentist in Simpsonville. So he has kind of, the financial ability to kind of resist some of this. He's not, that isn't as much a factor as for him as actually kind of preserving this land. And he has a cattle farm there, but again, that's not his main source of income. And his daughter lives, just on the property there as well. So, and she's very invested, and she helps with the cattle, and she's been helping out on the farm since she was 12. So she's invested in it as well. And the part of what I wanted to kind of reflect with his place in this story was these are the conditions that kind of have to be in place for you to be able to resist this growing pressure. You have to be financially independent. You have to have a generation that's bought into it. And you have to have a really deep connection to the land and want to kind of preserve that way of life. But even for him, I mean, he's becoming surrounded by development at this point. There's, he grew up on that property surrounded by family members. A lot of his cousins and other relatives have sold in the years since then, and all of their property is turning into developments at this point. So he's really being surrounded by property, by subdivisions at this point, even though he's very committed and capable of preserving his own land. The other family who was kind of in the middle was Dorothea Thomason and Jay Merritt. It's an aunt and nephew who kind of own a lot of land together, more kind of outside the Malden area. And they're really kind of in the process of figuring out whether they want to sell. It seems like, for Jay, who is the younger generation, it seems to a degree to be a foregone conclusion that this is just what's going to happen. For his aunt Dorothea, it seems to be more tipping in that direction. She's kind of getting to a point where she's saying, I don't know if I can justify not selling, but it's an incredibly emotional decision for her. It's her father started this very successful dairy farm there. It's been land that was farmed by her family since the 1800s. She has a really deep connection to it, and she's kind of watched, sadly for a long time as this area has changed. A large portion of her land was seized through eminent domain to make way for the Southern Connector, and their family really fought hard against that. And she said specifically to me, I wasn't selling because I didn't want to contribute to the traffic, but she's just seen it go up, and the traffic continue to increase over the years. And when you drive to her house, she has this beautiful home there, and it's still pretty rural, but you see on either side, signs pointing to Ryan Homes, signs pointing to other subdivisions that are going in. So she talked about it was very often, you didn't see any cars on that road when she was a kid. Now at 5 p.m., there's traffic jams as people are trying to get to work. So I think she's to a degree seeing kind of the writing on the wall in a way, and she's starting to tip in that direction. So there's some of that generational divide there where, I think Jay is a little bit more open to selling, and they've been having some discussions with people who would be buyers, but she's still reluctant, but I think kind of tipping in the other direction. And then on the other side of the spectrum from George Hughes, there's the Hawthorne family who, is actually in the process of selling. They found a buyer. And what's happened there is, I think it's about 277 acres of land outside of the Simpsonville kind of Malden area. And, they are trying to sell, but there's been some logistics there that have been a problem. The County Planning Commission rejected a rezoning request that would have made way for, kind of up to 861 homes, if I'm remembering correctly, that exact figure. But but they're still working to do it. And that was just an incredibly, I think, gut-wrenching decision for Penny Hawthorne. She's really the matriarch of that family. She's resisted for a long time, but they finally kind of came to that decision. I think, again, it's that financial incentive just became too much to resist. She described it, she kind of needs money to live off of, and this is where a lot of her family's wealth is, and it just became an offer that she couldn't refuse at that point.
So we've already established you worked on this story for a long time. We had a lot of edits and revisions and things that we worked on. I think the last thing we did in the story, we were still changing the language in the first sentence. And I think we probably finally ended up in the right place. We talked about how subdivisions sort of notched into the countryside. A lot of these folks you're talking about, it's not as if they've never sold pieces of their land before, right? This is sort of whittled down over time a bit.
Sure, yeah. So like the Hawthorns, who I was just talking about, they have, I think, I don't know the exact acreage, but it's still a really sizable chunk of land. But they used to own 800 acres right there, and a lot of that's been developed already, been sold already. In the case of Jay Merritt and Dorothea Thomason, her maiden name is the Riddles, so that it was the Riddles who kind of really owned a lot of that area. But her sister, Dorothea Thomason's sister, Jay Merritt's mother, who passed away not too long ago, she had sold, I think it was about 90 or so acres before she passed for development, really for money to kind of live off in her older age. So, it is kind of a piecemeal situation where chunks of this land is being sold off, and we're getting to a point where they're talking about taking really pretty much what remains at this point and selling that for development. So I think it is important to point out that a lot of this land remains largely rural, and it's at this point it's not dominated by development, but it's quickly transforming just kind of the character of this area, and especially when you have huge tracts that can sell all at once because one family owns them and developments be built on them very quickly. It can really just quickly transform the identity of an area.
So we're going to get back to, there's several issues that raises, of course, and we're going to get back to one, the actual need for homes in the area, and also the strained infrastructure. We're going to talk about both of those in a minute, but let me briefly go to what local government is doing here. So you've covered, as you mentioned before, you've covered Malden, Simpsonville, Fountain closely. Obviously, some of the land we're talking about here is adjacent to those cities and in Greenville County. What are all those bodies doing to sort of control and manage all this? And, what steps are they taking?
Sure. So I think it's important to point out that there's a tremendous amount of, the unincorporated land in Greenville County is unzoned, which, is one barrier for this kind of development, or one way to help control it. And there was recently a specific, rural agricultural zoning designation that was put in place. And I think a lot of people are hopeful that that's going to help stem the tide of some of this in a way. So, and, something to be mindful of with zoning is that zoning can always be changed. People can petition for it to be changed if there's enough impetus, but it is kind of one more barrier. And I think what a lot of the hope with this is if enough people in a particular area band together, multiple property owners, whether you own a farm or you own undeveloped land near a farm, if you kind of band together, that's going to send a message of what the people in that area want for that area. So I think that people are hopeful that that'll make changes, but again, that can always be, zoning can always be changed if there's enough will for it. Things are also happening on a kind of a local level. Something that I don't think ultimately made it in the story was that, Fountain Inn is within its own city limits, is looking at doing kind of a zoning overhaul to help protect some areas that it's designated specifically for agricultural and rural kind of preservation. And then something that people are doing on a more individual level is these conservation easements, where you kind of make an agreement with a land trust where you retain ownership of the property, but the development rights kind of go to this land trust, and it essentially ensures that there's going to be no future large scale development on it. So that's what a lot of is going on, just in terms of the efforts to stem some of this, to stop encroachment on large tract farms and things of that nature, on kind of a local government and an individual level.
So this story was part of a Post and Courier series, sort of an occasional series called Boom and Balance. The boom, I think we understand. Is there a sense from folks you've talked to where the balance is in this? Where do we sort of say, okay, this area is rural residential, this area is suburban residential, this area is rural? Are there discussions along those lines, or is it really just a piecemeal approach?
I think it's a little of both. I mean, to a degree, I think that just the amount of undeveloped land that there is in Greenville County, and just the momentous surge in demand. I mean, I think it's worth pointing out, I think a lot of local officials in a lot of ways are kind of drinking out of a fire hose in a way. I mean, I think they're talking, it's, if I'm remembering the figures correctly, it's 250,000 more residents anticipated within the next 40 years, which is just a massive surge in the population here. And it's growth that Greenville County it's on a scale that Greenville County has really never seen. So in a lot of ways, this is kind of unprecedented territory for the area. And with just the amount of land that's undeveloped and outside of any municipality, and the amount of just the area that the county is tasked with managing, I think there are efforts. I think again that agricultural zoning designation is part of that. I think in talking with an expert from Clemson University, he was talking about, I mean, trying to think of it in a more creative way, where you're having transitional rural residential areas as a buffer between just complete suburban residential and kind of actual farming operations. Which is happening to a certain extent, but again, I think that there's just with the scale of what the county and these municipalities are dealing with, it's a difficult thing to kind of tackle.
So it didn't come up that much in your story, but I know the word density gets batted around a lot, these zoning meetings and planning and other things. How does sort of this obtain a piece of land, build a subdivision in what used to be a rural area, how is that being sort of balanced out with the idea that with a large population growth, you need some level of housing density?
Sure. So I think that there is some move towards that, especially at like the local city levels. I think it's just becoming more and more clear that that's going to be a necessary thing to do. I mean, looking at things more like townhouses and duplexes and redeveloping properties that are developed but haven't been used kind of at their most efficient level. Just that's going to be something that has to happen, that infill is going to have to happen in all these already developed areas, and a move away from every single person moving to the area having a full acre or full half acre with their own just a single family house on it. I think it's often an uphill battle there. A lot of times established neighborhoods in municipalities really push back on higher density going in near them. And there's a lot of kind of misconceptions and a lot of, anxiety about that often. But I think that's something that has become more and more apparent that to a degree is what's going to happen. How much that can happen and on what scale and how much that can be used to abate this, is still being figured out. But that's definitely something that's become more part of the conversation.
So, let's talk a bit about this, because this is not, lest anyone be confused, this is not, well, we just want to buy some land and build some houses on spec. I mean, I think a story you'd written a couple of months back, and that the fact also got included in this story, was essentially Greenville County has zero available housing inventory. Right? Things get built, things get sold. In most cases, sold before they're done building. If I remember the exact number correctly, it was 0.7 months 0.7 months worth of inventory, which I think the expert you talked to basically said some houses will never sell, so that's essentially zero. So it's not as if we're building houses for no reason, right? There's a huge demand coming in. When you talk to home builders and experts on that, is this process, purchasing a piece of what used to be rural or undeveloped land and building a subdivision, is that the process they want, or is that just the process that's available to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit of both. I think a lot of these developers would prefer to maybe build closer into cities to do more of this kind of infill, but in a lot of places the zoning doesn't allow for that. I think there was some conversation in Simpsonville, and I'm not completely well versed on all the nuts and bolts of it, but that it's very difficult and perhaps prohibited to do kind of these duplex kind of developments there. And there's some conversation about whether that's hampering density, whether that's affecting whether housing is affordable. And so it leaves really the only options to a degree to go farther out from these municipalities. Obviously development is happening within the municipalities, and I think there's a lot of conversations going on how to address that to, again, get some of that denser development going on there. But, going farther out, kind of the drive until you can afford it, drive until you qualify, I think is one of the things that was kind of batted around. Going out into these more rural areas where you can buy land with less regulation, where it's less expensive, and build these larger tract kind of developments. I think that there is, I think that something that came out of that meeting, the forecast for home building in the future, is that Greenville County is really issuing home building permits at an unprecedented rate, but it's still just a drop in the bucket with the amount of demand that they're seeing. I think it was close to 10,000 permits that were issued in 2021 alone, but it's still just the absolute surge in demand. And that's a lot of different factors. Greenville County was already obviously seeing a huge surge, but with interest rates dropping and things of that nature, demand has surged even more in the past few months. So it's really just an unprecedented level of demand, and everyone's kind of scrambling to keep up, and it makes housing less affordable. It makes it so it's harder to grow the economy, and there is a real impetus and a real reason for why these houses are being built. But really what we wanted to focus on at the same time is what are the pitfalls of that, and kind of some of what's being lost with the transformation that's going on here.
Right. Yeah, I know the word sprawl comes up quite a bit, and we do have a question in from one of the folks who's watching this related to sprawl and how that's being dealt with. But the impression I've gotten, I did a question and answer panel with some local officials and developers and some home builders, and they were all pretty universal that they did want sprawl, that sprawl was a problem for them. One of the big reasons it is a problem is infrastructure. So let's talk a little bit about that. And then I do kind of want to get back to talk a little more about what you mentioned, which is, some of the folks in the rural land. But the infrastructure, anybody who's driven outside the city knows that it's mostly two-lane roads. I think everyone, at least hopefully, understands that sewer is not run, that all sorts of things have to happen. Who pays for all the infrastructure? And what are the issues you run into when you're trying to run, power, sewer, et cetera, to sort of these chunks of land that are separated from other development?
Sure. So yeah, I think one of the misconceptions that I think a lot of officials get frustrated with is you see a lot of people talking about, when some of these developments that they are not in favor of and don't want going in, when they happen, a lot of people start, making the allegation that it's, city officials, local officials are kind of money hungry and they just want to grow that tax base. But something that I've heard them frustrated about a lot, and that is borne out, and when you look at the actual math of it, and that the experts support as well, is that oftentimes it's a zero-sum gain, if that. It's with the price of putting this infrastructure in to support these developments, unless it's a very particular price point with a very particular density, it's often they're barely breaking even, or it's a little bit of a loss. With the amount of infrastructure they have to put in. I mean, there's electrical lines, there's road improvements, there's sewage, there's water lines, there's pump stations that often have to be put in and kept up to support a lot of these places based on the geography of the site. So, that's very difficult. And something that complicates it is that, the ownership of these roads, that's obviously often the hot button issues. What's this going to mean for traffic? Are they going to expand the roads before this happens? Who's going to do that? How much is that going to cost? So, the state owns a lot of these roads. The county owns some of them. Municipalities often own a kind of surprisingly small amount of the roads that are actually in the municipality. And local officials, often their hands are tied when it comes to actually expanding these roads. And even if they did take ownership, if it would be cost prohibitive often to do that for them on a kind of a large scale. So that's been a constant struggle. You look at some of the roads where these houses are going in. I mean, it really is very small roads that are servicing very large developments that are going in, and people have some real concerns about that.
Really, we probably need Nathaniel Carey, our Greenville County reporter, in for this, since he covered the meeting. But what are the other things that we just got a question in on related to, looking at that agricultural zoning that Greenville County put in place? I know there was some proposals to streamline that a bit that maybe got caught up in the politics and other things. But, how much is the agricultural zoning an option for some of the folks we talked to come up at all? And, is that related specifically to what you were writing about, or is it sort of more applicable to folks who are actually still trying to run farms and various other things?
Well, I think for a lot of the people I talked to, I mean, like, George Hughes, for example, the agricultural zoning for his land specifically isn't going to mean a whole lot because he's not planning on selling. He has no interest in doing that. And where it would have helped possibly is if before all of this growth started happening, everybody in that area had gotten together and said, we want this whole area to be zoned agricultural zoning. But, the horse is kind of out of the barn with that particular situation. That area is being more and more developed. He's kind of becoming an island of undeveloped land. And then with, the situation of, like Dorothea Thomason and Jay Merritt, I think that they're really considering selling, and there's a lot of considerations going into that. And obviously, the Hawthorne family is planning to sell. So I think in those specific situations, it wasn't as much a consideration or a factor for them. But I think for people who are a little bit outside of these major growth corridors where this is happening, that kind of see this coming, they're kind of watching it approach more and more. That's the people that this is really going to affect more significantly.
We had another question come in, and I'll just field this one for you, Conor, because it's probably too complicated for us to answer. We were asked, what's the best way to find out if a road is state, county, or municipality responsibility? Let me just go ahead and tell you, we have trouble figuring that out sometimes too. There are obviously detailed maps kept on all these roads. There's a huge amount of mileage that's actually state responsibility in the county. But if I remember the figures correctly, Greenville County is responsible for about 1,700 miles of roads. The municipalities, being smaller, for the most part, don't have a ton. But really, if you want to know specifically if a road is state, county, municipality responsibility, you probably have to check with the individual bodies to be sure. Some of them switch right in the middle, so it can be pretty tricky. But they do keep very detailed maps. But if you have any question at all, the simplest thing to do is to reach out to your local government body, and they should be able to tell you that. Conor, did I miss anything there? Is there an online resource for that?
Not that I'm aware of. I think it's worth pointing out that there's so many miles of road in this area that it's sometimes in meetings, you'll hear official, if a specific road comes up, they'll go, is that ours or is that DOT's? Do we know? And it'll be kind of a conversation, some shuffling of papers and trying to figure out whose it is. So, um, but yeah, as you said, I think that just reaching out directly to your local municipality or state agency to just ask is probably the best way to do it.
Um, we had a couple other things that we don't really have great answers for, but I do want to try to address the questions. We had one landowner ask us about sort of what dollar amounts a breaking point, when do you sell, that sort of thing. What's your advice on that?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, there's really no silver bullet that I could give you for that question. I think that's something that a lot of the people that I talk to are wrestling with, as well as what's a fair price, what's enough for them to decide to walk away from this land. All I could say is, the best resource would be talk to your neighbors about what they're hearing, about what their thoughts are. Perhaps talk to a real estate agent if you want to get that far down the line. Look at what you'll compare to comparable tracts throughout the county that have sold. But that's really the only advice I could give. There's no way I could provide kind of a dollar amount or anything like that.
Speak to the experts. We're happy to pass along information, but definitely always talk to folks who do this for a living. Another question come in that relates to Greenville County, and I think I can field that one. How do we know? Do we know how Greenville County will navigate the loss of the road fee that the Supreme Court ruled as being improper? Basically ruled it that it was a fee, a tax masquerading as a fee. Greenville County is still sorting through that issue. Obviously, it's a loss of revenue. If I remember correctly, it was $7.5 million a year that they were projecting they would lose from dropping that fee. Obviously, they're no longer collecting it. There's some discussion about some of the American Rescue Plan funds potentially being used to help buffer that. But I don't think Greenville County has a complete and total answer on that question yet. One thing I do know, if I remember the numbers correctly, in the budget this year, they have about $10 million allocated to road work. And if I remember correctly from Nathaniel Carey's story, that amounted to basically being able to do paving on about 29 miles of roads. Again, as I mentioned before, they maintain about 1,700 miles of road, so you can understand that there's probably some issues related to that. But I don't think we have an answer there yet. We're watching that closely. Conor, we've run long, and I usually don't do that, but I do want to end this on a more personal note. You sat down with a lot of folks for the story. You sat in their living rooms, you walked the land with them. What's sort of the thing that's going to stick with you from this story? What do you sort of revisit in your mind in your reporting?
Sure. I think it's one thing is definitely, talking with Penny Hawthorne, she was the woman who really has decided to sell at this point. She was emotional when she talked about this decision. It wasn't an easy decision for her. It isn't just land that they own. It's not just an investment. It's not just wealth. It's a part of their family legacy. It's a deep emotional attachment to the land and what it represents. And these forces that are coming into play are kind of putting these people at a crossroads where they're making these decisions, but they're not easy decisions. I think I got the same sense from pretty much everyone I talked to, and the family that I mentioned at the beginning, who the ownership has been divided up by between 15 or 16 cousins. There is some, in a sense, dilution of kind of their connection to the land, but still, even though the land hasn't served as a farm or really a family homestead for a long time, it's still the family land, and it's still where they do family reunions. It's still kind of a gathering place, and it's in talking with the guy who's really kind of at the center of this, their shared ownership of it. He talks about to a degree about how complicated that is and the issues that it creates, but also that it's kept them all connected and together, and it's really what they gather around most commonly. So it's this land. It is obviously there's a lot of economic and financial aspects to it. There's a lot for the surrounding community about what the future of this land is going to mean. But there is, again, that just tremendously personal, familial connection to it that these people have. And that's really what's going on at the center of everything that's happening.
All right. Well, we thank you so much for joining us today, Conor. Thank you for your reporting and insight into this story. I appreciate your time. Thank you all for watching Beyond the Headlines. We'll post this recording on our website in case you want to watch again or share it with someone. postandcourier.com/beyond-the-headlines. That should be up later today or tomorrow morning at the very latest. You can support our work by signing up for any of our free newsletters at postandcourier.com/Greenville/newsletter-sign up. Paid subscribers make our brand of journalism possible and help us keep communities informed. In order to do that, we need you to subscribe. We cannot do what we do without your support. So please check us out at postandcourier.com/Greenville/subscribe. And you can support our investigative efforts by going to postandcourier.com. Look at the box toward the top of the page. There are several efforts you can donate towards. All of that money goes specifically toward gathering information and reporting in the state of South Carolina. On behalf of Conor and the entire Post and Courier team, we thank you so much for your time. See you again soon. Thank you.